marks, and we are now getting into the second lecture on the history of Anglicanism. I didn't get any questions from you all, which you're supposed to send to Shay, so if you want to, just send questions to Shay. She puts them together and sends them on for me. For the second time, I will warn you that when I take off this mask, and if I have to turn around or put my finger in my mouth, it's because this is not my regular partial bottom here. I've lost 10 pounds and my good expensive one doesn't fit anymore, and I had to take the cheap temporary and cram it in my mouth, so you would not be offended by my loss of teeth in the bottom row. One can only hope that they don't explode out of my mouth at some time during the lecture and knock poor Ron Barnett out. All right. Now, the second thing is, I watched this thing myself to find out if I made any mistakes, and I found one that annoyed me. I told you last week that if you were to trace the ancestry of the Norman French, who were indeed the same thing as the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, the Frisians, they're all North Germanic, and we know that because they passed down a Y chromosome. Foolishly I said X, I don't know why. The Y chromosome is the male chromosome and it hardly ever changes, so you can trace ancestry that way. Now, while I have my famous assistant here, while not Vanna White is Ron Barnett, I'm going to point out where some of these places are. First of all, we're trying to stay 6 feet apart here, we've got St. Albans, for St. Alban was martyred, just right north of London. We have where St. Patrick came from in northern England, over here in the Lake District. This is Wales, this is Cornwall, where the old British Church survived. The island of Iona is right there, and that's where St. Columba founded the famous monastery for the evangelization of northern England and Scotland. And then over here is Lindisfarne, a small island where St. Aidan went to do his evangelical work in Northumbria. And then right next to the B is where Whitby was, where the Great Council was. This gives you kind of an idea where things are in Britain. Thank you so much, Ron. Now, we will do a quick little repeat of what happened last week. Roberta Walker, if she's walking, will smile, and I always said, last week on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., well, last week on the history of Anglicanism. We talked about the first Christians in Britain. We know probably in the 2nd century, the only real written proof we have is in the 3rd century, when both Bede and Gildas write about St. Alban in the Roman city of Verulamium, which is now called St. Albans, and he was martyred there. We know of the old Welsh and Cornish church, the old British church from St. Gildas. The church fathers Tertullian and Origen claimed that there were Christians in Britain in the 2nd century. Archaeologists have unearthed mosaic floors from Roman villas that have Christian symbolism, and as you saw last week, actually one figure of the Christ with the Chi-Rho behind his head. So, St. Patrick, 389 to 461, was taken as a slave to Ireland. He escaped. He went to Gaul. He was instructed and ordained and sent back to evangelize the Irish. And by 461, Ireland is Christian. In 410, Rome leaves Britain. They had to go back, everyone, soldiers, infrastructure, to fight off the barbarians at the gate in Rome. I can now take this off because Ron and I are no longer trying to stay away from one another, okay? Now, so they're left on their own. That's in 410. In 476, the Roman Empire fell. But in the meantime, you've got these Romano-British people who had a pretty good life there, probably speaking Latin and Celtic, which we call Old Welsh, until the Saxons begin to come in, the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisians, a whole bunch of people, because it was Good living over there. We do not know if it was an invasion with battles. Most archaeologists think not these days, or if it was just settlement taking over. But all the Christians moved west into Wales, Western England, and Cornwall, and that's called the Old British Church. That's the oldest group. Now, St. Columba in Ireland left after getting himself into a little passel of trouble to preach the gospel to the people of northern England and Scotland. He set up his monastery on Iona, which I pointed out up there, a little teeny island off of Scotland, and had great success. Now, at this point, when Columba died in 597, the Pope sent St. Augustine to, the Pope didn't know there were Christians up there, to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine did not want to go. I mean, there were pagans up there, they might kill him, but he did finally go. And when he got there, he found out that Ethelberg's wife, Berta, was a Christian, even had her own chapel and her own priest there with her, a bishop, I think, actually. Augustine then got into contact with the Old British Church, the Welsh bishops, said they must submit to him and to the Pope. They said, who's the Pope? And they had wanted nothing to do with him, so things went on. The Saxons were once the king went, the rest of the country went too. They sent to the north Paulinus to evangelize Northumbria. He had some success, and then a pagan king came in with a big army and crushed it all, and only one person was left there, and that was James the Deacon. In the meantime, when Penda died, the pagan, the heirs to the throne, who had run away, smartly so, as they were likely to get killed, went to Iona. So they came back as Celtic Christians. Paulinus had been a Roman Christian. And so he came bringing with him, or asking for St. Aidan. St. Aidan came in speaking Gaelic, and so they went about working together, Oswald and Aidan, and converted Northumbria. Okay, so now, at this point, you've got a Celtic church, a Roman church, and the Old Welsh church, and they need to get together somehow. I mean, royal families, the wife was still in Lent and the husband was in Easter, and it just didn't work out real well. So under Hilda of the Abbess of Whitby, they had a synod there. Show you where Whitby was, up north, okay? And there they decided that they would, everyone, become part of the Western Church in Europe, which is to say the church of which the patriarch was the Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope. Now, the Pope didn't have the kind of authority he later did, but there's where it was. So we go on through the invasions of the Anglo-Saxon Church, which was very lovely, homely Catholicism, when they all converted. Part of them were Vikings. King Alfred the Great was responsible for that. A good half of England was ruled by the Danes, called the Danelaw. But they converted. Canute became the King of England and Denmark. After Canute died, Edward the Confessor, an Anglo-Saxon, became the king. He didn't speak any Anglo-Saxon. He was raised in France. And Edward named William of Normandy as his successor, but then just before his death, he bequeathed the throne to the Saxon Harold. Harold was defeated by William the Conqueror, who claimed the throne, got the approval of the Pope, and then just remade the church and the nobility. The Anglo-Saxons were kicked out, and the Norman French were put in. So, we're going to kind of begin there saying that William died, succeeded by William II, William Rufus, who was really, he didn't have much sense, and he was not a very good king. He was succeeded by his younger brother, Henry. Now, and here's where it gets difficult, and I've got to think to get this right. Okay, Henry wanted his daughter, Matilda, to become the regent, but being, male chauvinist back in those days, other people thought it should be his nephew, Stephen. So it's Stephen versus Matilda, and there is a civil war. For any of you who like to read the Brother Cadville mysteries or watched it on television, this is the time period. They're always talking about the wars and the battles between Stephen and Matilda. Eventually what happens is that they make a deal that Stephen can stay on the throne if he swears that Matilda's children will inherit. Well, it so happened that about 2 years after making the deal, Stephen died. And who then succeeds is one of the sons of Matilda, Henry II, Duc d'Anjou. Anjou was a big part of France. And he had married quite well. He had married Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had a great big hunk of what is now France. So they had now England and France, big kind of empire there. If you want to see what a dysfunctional family looks like, there's a wonderful movie made called A Lion in Winter that has Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn as Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine and their children. Now, when Henry succeeds, a new dynasty happens. Because remember, Henry was the last of William's brood. So what comes forth now is another one. And they took a name, although it wasn't recognized for a while, of a little plant that grew in Aquitaine called the Planta genetus, or Plantagenet. So they were the Plantagenets, sometimes called the brood of the devil. They had some strange people. If any of you ever got into watching Game of Thrones, I have not seen it, they say they modeled the nobility off the Plantagenets in a Game of Thrones. Okay, now we get into some interesting stuff happening about the church in the reign of Henry II. So, Henry succeeded William, appointed, and he had a good buddy, a good buddy named Thomas à Becket. And he and Henry were good friends, and Henry thought, remember this investiture controversy, who's really going to get to pick the bishops and give them their vestments? Should it be the king or the pope? And so Henry figured, I can take care of this. I will simply appoint my good buddy Thomas à Becket to be Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, Becket said, you might not want to do that, because if you do, I will stand for what the office stands for. Well, Henry II kind of poo-pooed him until things got kind of bad, and it looked like indeed that Becket was going to oppose Henry when it came to the appointment of bishops. Well, okay. So Henry comes down on Becket. Becket has to flee, lives abroad for 6 years. Then he comes back. It looks like they're going to make up, but no, there are a couple of things. One was called benefit of clergy. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the other was this investiture thing. And so one night, and this is in France where Henry was, he was having a big drunken banquet. He was in his cups, and he gets the news that Thomas is back there and still making, standing up against him and for the side of the church. Now, Thomas really had, at that point, become pretty holy. He wore a hair shirt and said all of his prayers, and the man was, he became what he was, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So Henry shouts out, of those here eating the bread at my table, can no one help me with this problem of Becket? Now, he did not say, could no one rid me of this troublesome priest? I think he might have in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, but that's what goes down. Anyway, that's what he meant. Can no one rid me of this treasonous priest? And so 4 knights took out, sailed across the English Channel, got to Canterbury Cathedral, made a big ruckus, wanted Becket to recant all of this and give in to Henry, and he would not do that. And then, right then and there, they drew their swords and killed Thomas à Becket in a bloody kind of thing. At the time they said they sliced off the top of his head. I don't know if that's true, but they certainly killed him and there was blood all over the place. So Thomas à Becket had been martyred in his own cathedral. I hope Ron can find a picture of that. It has that kind of modernistic crucifix above it on the pillar. I have been there. It's very touching to see where Thomas was martyred. So, Henry made a big mistake at that. Even at the death, people would come in and soak their handkerchiefs and where the blood was on the floor. All kinds of strange stories began, like a man had his blood soaked with a handkerchief, and he put it in a bucket of water and bathed his wife with a bucket of water. The woman had suffered from palsy all of her life and cured her immediately. I'm not inclined to believe those things, but I am inclined to believe they did all come in and get a bit of that blood. That did happen. Okay, so Henry had to repent. He knew he was caught if he wants to keep his crown. So he went to Canterbury and knelt before Becket's tomb, which had become a place of pilgrimage, buck naked, as I recall, and the monks whipped him, leaving welts on his back. And so I think he did repent. He was sorry. He was actually fond of Becket, but he lost his temper, as kings are wont to do. So the Canterbury Cathedral became a place of pilgrimage, because that's where they built this big, glorious shrine to Thomas à Becket. People came from all over England, and if you will remember your Canterbury Tales from Chaucer, all that when opera with the child sota stuff came in, you know, then after folk to go on pilgrimages, the holy martyr for to seek him. So then people often go on pilgrimage to seek the holy martyr. They were going to Canterbury to St. Thomas à Becket's shrine. So it was kind of a big deal. Now, of Henry II and Eleanor's children, and you can see them when they are still young. If you get from Amazon the Lion in Winter, God, dysfunctional family, it's just incredible. The oldest was Richard, the youngest was John. There were a couple in between. Geoffrey was one, I can't remember all of them. The two you'll have to remember are Richard and John. So Richard becomes the king, and he goes on crusade, leaving his younger brother John in control. At this point, the Pope appointed Stephen Langton Archbishop of Canterbury. John refused Langton, and he kept refusing. He just was not going to have anything to do about that. And so the Pope excommunicated John and put the entire country of England under interdict. What did that mean? The clergy were forbidden to function. The only thing they could do was baptize. No weddings, no funerals, no masses, no offices, no nothing. The people were left. It was a horrible time. It lasted for 6 years. People did not get married. They felt badly about that. The corpses piled up in the churchyard, and some people had to go bury their family members in ditches around the town. It was not a good time. I think to myself sometimes in this terrible time of our plague about not getting to go to church and have it like it used to be, and that's going to last about a year for us, I think. Think about 6 years, no church. So, at any rate, back he comes, Richard, from the Crusades. He gets captured by people. They have to pay a big ransom for him, but finally he dies, and John becomes the king. All right. Now, the Pope controls England at this point because John caved into the Pope to get him to lift the interdict, and he presented England to the Pope as a gift and received it back as a fiefdom. Now, what does that mean? It means, in effect, that he sold the country to the Pope, but got to remain not as the owner, but the CEO. And that's what happened. The barons in the church did not like that. They were no longer their own people. They belonged to the Pope. So they had a fit and made John sit down and write out a set of rules about how England would be governed and how the church would be governed and who owned it. And they met in a field to do this, and what they produced was called the Magna Carta. And for the first time in England's history, the king was not above the law. Now, this is important stuff. Even though Magna Carta didn't amount to much in its early days because kings ignored it, it certainly did as a foundation stone, not only for England, but for for us who inherited that tradition in other countries. No one is above the law. and that's the gift of Magna Carta. And the church felt that they had their freedom back again because they didn't belong to the Pope. So if you walk into the gate of Canterbury Cathedral, they quote a line from the Magna Carta over the main gate, Ecclesia Anglicana Libera Sit, and that means the church in England shall be free. And that's been interpreted various ways, not only from the Magna Carta, but from the Reformation, from all kinds of stuff, okay? And all of that comes when John was the king. Now, we are into the Middle Ages, and we have to kind of pick and choose some of the stuff we want to talk about. I want to talk about the big gripe between Henry II and Becket over the benefit of clergy. When I was younger and I heard someone, was condemned without benefit of clergy, I thought it meant they were led to the gallows and the priest couldn't be there to give them absolution. No, it isn't that at all. It means there were two sets of courts, the church courts and the secular courts. And the church courts were a lot more lenient than the secular courts. So if a cleric, a monk, a priest, a bishop, anyone who claimed to be a cleric, if they got caught, embezzling money or stealing an apple off the stall or, messing with someone else's wife, they would choose benefit of clergy because they would get off easier. You can see why Henry II didn't like that. There should have been one law for the whole country. And that's where it all came down, and that's why the interdict came down. So we have two things on that, benefit of clergy under Henry II and also the investiture problem. Benefit of clergy was only repealed in England in 1820. And it may surprise you that the Diocese of Los Angeles has an ecclesiastical court. Ecclesiastical courts are generally in all the dioceses of the American Church to deal with things like clergy who do perhaps embezzle or mess with someone else's wife or something like that. They also have to answer to the secular arm, but they are tried in ecclesiastical court, and judges of the ecclesiastical court are elected at your diocesan convention. I don't know if they've heard of a case in God knows how long, but we have one. Now, what happened with corruption and degeneration of the church in the 14th and 15th century? And that was the growth of the vicarage system. Usually a monastery or a cathedral would own what was called the benefice or the living of a church. They owned who would pay the clergy, okay? So they could choose the clergy. Sometimes they fell in hard times and they would sell it to someone else, the living. So if someone owned the living of St. Mark's, it meant, that person got to appoint the priest. We would have nothing to do with it. Incidentally, that's never happened in the United States, happily. So what happened was nobles began to buy up these livings, these benefices. And what they did to make money was, since some of these livings were quite lucrative, they would pay a smaller amount for someone to actually run the parish, and they would keep what was left over. So they could make a lot of money that way, and the person running the parish then was no longer the rector. He was there instead of the rector, and there was a word for that, vicar. So that person became the vicar. And so much so that you still hear English people, when they refer to any priest, they'll talk about, well, he was the vicar. I was amazed and tickled and somewhat affronted that when our presiding bishop, who is equivalent to an archbishop, went to preach the marriage of Kate and Harry, the English press referred to him as that American vicar. Fools, but there it is. Now, you hear about this in Chaucer, who talked about the poor parson, and he may have been representative of the clergy because he was a vicar. He was paid a small amount of money as the person who owned the living made a lot. There was a man called Bogo de Clare, a son of the Earl of Gloucester in Hartford. He acquired so many benefices that at his death in 1291, he was receiving in today's money about $250,000 just in rent off those churches, putting poor vicars in there. There was another thing that happened that was not a terribly good idea, but it had one good result, and that was the growth of the chantries. Now remember, in the Middle Ages, There are ways you can buy yourself into heaven. The whole idea of good works, if you couldn't do a good work, you could pay someone else to do it. And if you died, you know, and not having led a very good life, you could endow a chantry. You could build this little chapel-like thing in the parish church or someplace else. Sometimes it could be as big as a whole church. And you would endow it to pay a priest to say a mass for your soul, you know, forever. These were endowed chantries, thereby assuring himself that person they would get into heaven. Well, more on that when we deal with the Reformation, but you can't buy your way into heaven, and you can't get someone else to pray you out of purgatory. Now, their idea of purgatory was not what Episcopalians would think. We call it the church expectant, kind of the anteroom of heaven. It's where your sins are cleansed before you enter into the full presence of God, and even that, you have to understand that since God is outside time or space, well, there it is. If you want a good idea about what the difference between hell and purgatory is, you can read C.S. Lewis. It's hell if you're staying there, it's purgatory if you're getting out. So, read sometime, you know, the stuff that C.S. Lewis wrote. Now, the good thing about this was these priests running chantries had a lot of time on their hands. I mean, they go in the morning, they devoutly sing a mass for their patron who had endowed the chantry, but they had some time left over, and so they were encouraged to teach the children of the parish. And so the really good folks who helped the person the incumbent, the rector of the church they were in, helped him in his duties and taught children. And one of them was a chantry-endowed school that started by the priest. You may have heard of it. It was called Eton. One of the really posh schools in England started out as a chantry school. Now, I would like to speak briefly about Wycliffe, 1328 to 1384. John Wycliffe was a reformer who attacked images, clerical authority, and greed. He was not the only one. People were outspoken sometimes because they had this vicar system and chantries, and sometimes the priests were so ignorant they couldn't say the Our Father in Latin, and so it caused a great kind of problem, and they were thoroughly criticized by people working for universities who thought the institutional church completely corrupt. Wycliffe translated the Bible. Now, Wycliffe was no big saint. As someone wrote of him at the time, he was called the morning star of the Reformation because he translated the Bible and accused the clergy of being no good. But it was said then he was so little a saint and so much a scholar. He himself was a pluralist. That's the kind of person that buys up these livings and then farms it out for very little money to someone else. When he was sent to Bruges as a royal commissioner, he made 20 shillings per day, Wycliffe did, which was as much as he paid his vicar in Ludgerswell in 3 months. You know, not too good. He was a scholar and a critic. He was aroused by abuses. He was always ready to strike out, often with more courage than discretion. And he struck out against the authority of the church and the state and called the Pope an Antichrist, the head vicar of the fiend, and a simple idiot who might be a damned devil from hell. Well, tell us what you really mean, Wycliffe, you know, so. Priests were not necessary, all were equal, and if character was missing, it's all missing. So, he talked about the right to property, spiritual as well as temporal, is dissolved. Beating the French Revolution, all property is theft, and the communist, all property should be held in common. He was condemned by the Pope, but outlasted his trials in court. But they got back. After he died, they came and dug him up and burnt his corpse. Well, those were strange times. He had followers that are often tarred with this brush, and that's kind of unfair, called the Lollards. And they were mostly in parish life. They tended to not be very concerned about the saints and Mary, but only Jesus. Their churches were simple with a large crucifix over an altar, and they lasted for a long time. They were still, it was a movement that did. I've always kind of liked the Lollards. Wycliffe's a bit overstated, but the Lollards were just trying to be good Reformed Catholics, kind of like Anglicans wanted to be later on. Now, there's one other person I want to talk about in the Middle Ages, and I hope you will go on to do something about reading more here, and that is St. Julian of Norwich, often called Mother Julian of Norwich, often called Dame Julian of Norwich. The Roman Catholic Church has never canonized Mother Julian of Norwich, but the Anglicans kind of have, because the way we consider someone a saint is we put them on our calendar. They have a feast day in which they are commemorated. So the Church of England and the Church of South Africa and other places like that and the American Episcopal Church have a day. So I don't mind calling her St. Julian of Norwich. I hope someone names churches after her. She was a mystic. There were three big mystics in that particular time, 14th and 15th century. She was born in 1343. She died in 1415. In 1373, she had a debilitating illness which incapacitated her for a week, and she had a vision of Jesus. Now, I find that kind of important, and I like it. And I think that when you are, in a bad shape, comatose as it were, the right side takes over, and sometimes these things do happen. Same thing with dreams. I will admit, I think that God does visit us sometimes. And I like it better that it was Jesus. I've often wondered why it is in the Roman Church, like Our Lady of Guadalupe and Our Lady of Lourdes and Our Lady of Fatima and Our Lady of Medjugorje, why does he always send his mother? Why doesn't he come himself, himself? Well, the medieval mystics had visions of Jesus, and I think that was good. So you had Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp and Hilton, Wallace Hilton, can't remember his first name, Walter Hilton, okay. I want to talk a little bit about Julian of Norwich. Julian's a good person to read and study and meditate on at a time like this when so many of us are isolated, okay, on purpose. We're trying to avoid the plague. So she called these visions of Jesus her showings, and she wrote them down. She was a literate woman, and those were called the Revelations of Divine Love. It's a book. And we have a person on staff who knows a great deal about Julian of Norwich, and that's Deacon Susie. And I would make bold to say here that maybe Deacon Susie, you should come on and talk about Julian of Norwich. So anyway, Jesus spoke to her at various stages of his passion. He spoke to her mind and her soul. She wrote down these things. At first she thought the showings were delirium. This was not a crazy woman. But when Christ spoke to her, she was not merely passive, but questioned him closely about the nature of sin, the reasons for it, and the consequences of it. Where she received no satisfactory answer, she just trusted in what the church taught her. So she said, God is more nearer than our own soul, for he is the ground on which it stands. As the body is clad in clothes, and the flesh in skins, and the bone in flesh, and the heart in the body, so are we, soul and body, clad and enclosed in the goodness of God. Puzzled by the paradox of sin, why God allowed it in the world, that is a question we all deal with. If God is all good, where'd sin come from? Why does he permit it, okay? She does not blame God for her sins, why God allowed it in the world. She says, he does not blame me for it. So she won't blame God for it. She is comforted by the revelation that sin is all that is not good, makes us know ourselves and ask for mercy, and brings us to a recognition of our dependence on God and his love for us. So, God, our Father, holds on to us so tenderly when we sin. I find a great deal of hope in what... The older I get, the more I know. I've had a record of sin behind me for 76 years now. So it's good to hear that. Our failing does not stop him loving us. Once a sinner's soul is healed by penance, God views our sins not as wounds, but as honorable scars. God loves us endlessly, and we sin constantly. And Julian portrays God as a mother. Now, he's one of the first times this happens, where God, our mother, shows up in Western theology and life. God is a mother who feeds us with herself in the sacrament of the Mass, and who, as our patient mother, does not want us to flee away, but wants us to do as a child does. For when it is diseased and afraid, it runs quickly to its mother. And Holy Church is our mother's breast. That's just a wonderful feminist and Christian understanding about Mother Church. So, Julian stresses not only God's love for us, but also God's need of our love for him. We are shown God's love for us by penance and prayer. Even if the prayer seems forced or mechanical, it is still full pleasant to God. How many of us, when we say our prayers, and I certainly know this, I pray 2 sets of prayers a day, and sometimes my mind is on, the current election more than it is on God. I will admit that. And it's a good thing that sometimes, but still, it's important to pray. Even if you don't feel this great, wonderful thing in your heart, it's important to pray. Okay. So Julian does not dwell on the medieval themes of hell and purgatory, but is very optimistic. The soul which beholds the love of Jesus will not hate hell, but mortal sins. And the sin which concerns Julian most is despair, and she says the remedy is God's unfailing love for us. So her comforting words are, and she is known for this, remember this, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. So I'm hoping you will look some more into Dame Julian. You can start by doing the Wikipedia article on her on your phone or your tablet or your computer. And Deacon Susie knows a lot about Mother Julian. So that was your quick look into the Middle Ages. I was going to try to get into the first part of the Reformation, but I shall not. I may go over next time, as I'm going to have to explain Luther and Lutheranism, Calvin and Calvinism, and then that ever-present question on everyone's lip, did Henry VIII start the Anglican Church? I can answer that now. No. Henry was never an Anglican. He was a wicked and disobedient Roman Catholic, maybe a pretty good king. So we'll talk about Henry, and we'll talk about all the things that came together at that particular time in the 16th century, the 1500s. 1517, Luther put his thesis on the wall. 1533 or thereabouts, Henry nationalized the Catholic Church and made himself the head of it. And so we will deal with that next week. And I thank my assistant for holding up the map that shows you where you are there. And we will see you next week. Send in your questions.